Welcome, everybody. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you are joining us from today and your organization that you are joining us from also. So hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for the online launch of Good Intentions 2026. We are really pleased to see a strong audience joining us from across the faith investment and wider financial community here today. For those who may be less familiar with Faith Invest, we are an international nonprofit organization working to support faith organizations and the wider faith consistent investing ecosystem to align capital with faith values. That includes convening conversations like this one, developing research like Good Intentions, and helping to support faith communities, faith organizations to translate their faith principles into investment decision making and in practice through guidance and education. Today's launch is part of that work, and to those of you that have just joined us, we will be sharing a recording of this launch with all registered attendees later today. So what is Good Intentions 2026? Good Intentions 2026 is an in-depth data-driven analysis of the faith investment sector. It's based on 275 publicly available investment policies from across faith traditions worldwide. The report looks at how faith commitments are translated into investment guidance. So, in other words, what faith organizations actually say on paper about how their faith shapes their investment decisions. Over the next while, so over the next 30 minutes or so, I will go through some of the top headline findings of our Good Intentions research and then turn to the report's co-author, our executive chair, Dave Zellner, for some questions and answers. We'll also invite our sponsors, who I'll name shortly, to share some perspective on the report. But please pop your questions into the chat over the next 30 minutes. I know some of you have already sent in some questions in advance, which we do hope to address. So please add in your questions, keep them relevant to what you hear about Good Intentions, to what we discuss, and we will get to them throughout the course of the webinar. So a brief overview about why we carried out the Good Intentions research, why this research matters at this time. Before I begin, I've already just mentioned our sponsors. We do want to extend our sincere thanks to the service providers that supported this research and helped make the report possible. Federated Hermes Limited, CCLA Investment Management, Concord Advisory Group, Oikyo Credit, and Tribe Impact Capital. We're very grateful for their support and engagement with this work. And we will be bringing in some perspectives from our sponsors over the course of this webinar. So why this research? Faith investors hold enormous untapped potential. Across the world, faith communities steward significant assets and often have very strong ethical and social commitments. But while the intention is often there to align their investments with their values and their mission, many faith organizations, as we well know, still lack clear frameworks for translating those values into investment practice. So Good Intentions 2026 tries to map that gap between values and implementation. And we also try to show where progress is possible. The report is built around Faith Invest's Level 1 faith consisting framework, which gave us a structured way to assess different aspects of policy and governance. So just to make it clear, the goal was not to rank or criticize organizations. It's really about understanding where the field, where the sector currently stands. what appears to support stronger faith-consistent investing, and where the wider ecosystem may need to evolve to better support faith-based investors going forward. And importantly, we wanted this report to remain practical and to be of use, useful for trustees, for investment committees, advisors, asset managers, denominational bodies, and others working in this space. So briefly, how was the research conducted? How did we approach the research? So as mentioned, we reviewed 275 publicly available investment policies from a range of different faith traditions, and using multiple online search engines and a structured search methodology. Importantly, the assessment was designed to be faith sensitive. So the policies of faith organizations were assessed according to the expectations of their faith communities, rather than against a single theological model. So importantly, the focus of the assessment was policy articulation, essentially what organizations publicly communicate about how they invest through their investment policy and guidelines. So this means the report looks at what is formally documented and visible, rather than trying to assess the full reality of every portfolio or institution. As mentioned already, each policy was assessed using Faith Invest's Level 1 Faith Consistent Investing Framework. And this framework evaluates 10 dimensions of policy alignment. Those 10 you'll see on the slide. We use this framework to structure the research. The 10 criteria ranged from faith documentation, so were the values of the faith documented within the policy. The framework also include positive and negative exclusions, right through to governance and decision-making, investment vehicle selection, education, monitoring review, stakeholder communication, and continuous improvement. I won't get into too much detail about each of those criteria. It is well explained in depth in the report itself. Each organization received an overall score out of 50, as well as scores across the individual criteria on the screen. That was a score out of 5. And what this gave us was not simply like a snapshot of faith consistent investing, but a broader picture of how faith commitments are or are not embedded into investment processes and structures. So what were some of the headline findings? Nearly 90%, I think it was 89% to be exact, of organizations scored below 30 out of 50. And what this suggests to us is that most are still operating at a fairly minimal or basic level of faith-consistent investing. And interestingly, none of the organizations within our data set that were assessed reached what we classified as outstanding alignment. Now, this doesn't mean that organizations are failing. In many cases, the commitment is there. But what it often reflects is that the implementation infrastructure, so the things like the expertise, the reporting structures, the investment tools, the vehicles, are still developing across the sector for this particular cohort of investors. At the same time, we identified some important areas of progress. So, for example, regular review of monitoring, so the extent to which faith alignment is reviewed and monitored over time alongside financial performance. Governance and decision-making arrangements also emerged as strong scoring areas. Many organizations already have relatively mature investment oversight structures in place. However, despite this, explicit integration of faith consideration within these governance structures was often a little less developed. So really interestingly to us, the weakest areas were positive investing and education and expertise. So what does this mean in simple terms? Faith investors are stronger at identifying what they want to avoid than identifying how they want their capital to actively contribute to positive outcomes that are aligned with their mission and their values. In terms of the education and expertise, many organizations are still heavily dependent on external advisors without having structured internal expertise in faith consistent investing. So this slide, I know the font is difficult to read, but this slide just gives a fuller picture of the 10 criteria and the average scores. And these slides will be available afterwards so you can get a better insight into the numbers. What's important here is not so much the individual numbers, but the overall pattern. So as mentioned, governance, relatively strong, monitoring processes exist in many organizations. But the areas linked to implementation, so things like positive investment, advisor guidance, education, vehicle selection, are all a little less developed. They're all at the bottom of that bar graph. And also interesting communication, so communicating to the various stakeholders within the faith organization, again, much less developed. So the challenge for many organizations to us is clearly no longer about defining what your faith values are in principle. I think faith documentation, you'll see in the bar graph, scored relatively okay in comparison to other areas. Really, where the challenge are for many organizations is operationalizing those values consistently in practice. So where can we go further? We grouped these criterion together. Well, when we group them together, we can identify three major gaps. The first, of course, is that positive investment gap. Faith investors are really clear about what they want to avoid, but less clear about how they want their investments to proactively support their mission and their values. The second, the implementation gap. So again, strong on faith commitments, but many organizations do not always verify whether their chosen investment vehicles can actually deliver on those commitments. And then the third is the capacity gap. So many organizations, they're very committed, but they're under-equipped. And this is often limited in terms of their own internal expertise. So overall, the issue is not so much a lack of values or necessarily a lack of commitment. More often, it's a lack of the practical infrastructure and support to go further. So what does this mean for the ecosystem, the faith consistent investing ecosystem? One of the strongest conclusions in Good Intentions is that faith consistent investing cannot be advanced by faith organizations alone, and stronger practice is linked to stronger ecosystem support. So the wider faith investment ecosystem matters here enormously. Where we see more developed approaches within our data set, there are usually things like denominational guidance, there are shared screening frameworks, specialist staff, pooled investment vehicles, and kind of access to collaborative engagement networks. So clearly, whether an organization has access to these supports, this is where we saw stronger alignment, higher scoring in the data set. So a grand conclusion before I turn to our sponsors and I turn to Dave. This means, I think clearly, is that strengthening faith consistent investing, it's an ecosystem effort. It's not just about the commitment and the intent of our faith organizations. It's also about all of us, or the asset owners, advisors, the denominational bodies, and all of us who work to support faith organizations. So on that note, I will turn to some of our sponsors who are with us here today. I'm going to invite Celia first from CCLA. Celia, if you can just share with us what you see, why did CCLA choose to support this research, and why do you think Good Intentions 2026 matters at this moment?
Thank you, Catherine. So, I mean, we're hugely supportive of the research, and this, alongside the other efforts to try and encourage people to fundamentally align their portfolios with our shared faith, or the faith of the organisation. I mean, what we see at CCLA, and we work with clients, we've got 30,000 charity and faith-based investors, so we see a really broad spectrum, and everything that you've pulled out in the report is exactly what we observe. So it's very much in line with what we see. There's definitely willingness. There's definitely no lack of values or an ability to articulate those values. There's definitely just that gap between the articulation of values and beliefs and the implementation. And I think we would echo your view that it is a collaborative effort. We need to do more as asset managers to support our investors to think about what we're actually doing for them that does actually align with their faith, but we need to help them articulate it. And the more that we can do to get investors to develop their policies, publish their policies, the more it, and I know this, this instinctively from writing the report, but the more developed policies that are out there, the more developed policies there will be out there. The congregations or the dioceses or the parishes with fewer resources or capacity will look to the larger ones, for guidance, for help to, do a very similar investment policy if they know that the resource of a much bigger congregation has already been deployed to make it really good. So, we just need to encourage, and your report goes a long way towards encouraging people to think more about the development of their policy and implementation.
Excellent. Thank you, Celia. Jessica from Oikyo Credit, again, tell us how, from an Oikyo Credit perspective, how important do you think this work is at this point in time?
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me first say that Oiko Credit is very proud to sponsor this report. Initially, Oiko Credit was founded in 1975 based on a movement within the World Council of Churches. So these Christian values were really part of our DNA. And for us, faith consistent investing is really a bridge between belief, responsibility, and real world outcomes. And currently, we live in a time or in a world with very high uncertainty, high volatility, and faith can provide guidance and orientation in all aspects of life. And the report, against the background of what you just described and the world we live in, this report really provides a very evidence-based and practical tool for investors to align their investments closer with their faith.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Kate from Tribe Impact, again, tell us why Tribe decided to sponsor this and the importance, of the report from your perspective.
Thanks, Catherine, and hello, everybody. Thanks so much for having us today. We're really delighted to be a partner with Faith Invest on this report. And we've had a long relationship, actually, going right back to the Zug guidelines back in 2017. So it's great to see the thinking going even further here. I mean, at Tribe, we've been around for 10 years now, and all that we do is about values alignment in investing. And we do that because we believe that that creates better portfolios that have outcomes, both from a financial perspective, but also for people and planet. So, it's really, really important to us. We think that the best way to kind of create that values alignment piece is through the SDGs, through impact. That's a really powerful way of articulating what values is, what your values are through investment. And we've seen, we have lots of a growing faith-based client base who we're really sort of proud to be working with, but that absolutely recognize that kind of education piece is critical. And the work that Faith Invest do and the work of this report is just so important. So thank you very, very much for doing it. And we're delighted to be part of it.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate, and thank you to all their sponsors. So I'm conscious of time, and I do want to bring in our co-author and our executive chair here in Faith Invest, Dave Zellner. I'm aware some of you submitted questions in advance. Please do add your questions to the chat as Dave and I go through some of the questions. We have received several thoughtful questions about how faith investors can contribute to a more just and sustainable world. Some of the questions do fall out of the scope of our good intentions research, but hopefully we will get to address those questions in later webinars. Dave, just turning to you, the headline numbers in this report are quite striking. So, 90% of organizations scored below 30 out of 50, and not a single organization reached outstanding. Before we dig into the detail, what does this tell us about the state of faith-consistent investing today?
Thanks, Catherine, and hello, everyone. It's really good to be with you all. Yeah, those numbers, Catherine, are quite surprising, but I think it's important to say it's not a verdict per se, but it's a starting line. And what they tell us is that faith-consistent investing is still an emerging discipline. The intention is unmistakable across all the 275 policies that we reviewed. The operational architecture to deliver on the intention is still in the process of being built. So why that matters now is pretty straightforward. Faith institutions, they collectively steward over trillions of dollars. And notably, at this point in time, secular ESG is under political pressure, and we're seeing a lot of institutions stepping back from value-based frameworks. And so this creates a moment where faith investors who are anchored in conviction but not subject to regulation, they're in a position that they incredibly lead. And the question isn't whether the field has potential, it's whether we can organize ourselves to realize it. Now, you mentioned about no one received a perfect score, an outstanding score. And that's not because they don't have the policies in place to achieve that score. Many people we talked to said, oh, for example, you showed that education and expertise is one of the lowest scoring criteria that was evaluated. And we've heard from organizations that, oh, yeah, we have a formal process for training our trustees and new staff on faith-consistent investing. It's just that we don't document in our investment policy. We would argue that, A, there are many organizations that do document education and expertise, how to achieve that in their policies. And B, it's good to memorialize that because trustees change, staff changes, and to have that formally documented in your investment policy ensures that in the future boards and future staff will be trained appropriately.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. A question that we received in advance is a really good question. What are the best practices that stand out in the data set? So what does best practice look like?
So there are three things that we think consistently distinguish the strongest performers in our database. The first is that they translate their beliefs into what we at Faith Invest call applied values. That is, that there are concrete lists of activities to avoid and to pursue, anchored in named denominational documents rather than generic ethical language. So the highest scores that have been achieved by organizations are those that reference specific theological sources that their tradition recognizes. Second, they make faith expectations explicit in their mandates with their asset managers. Advisors are contractually required to understand, screen for, and report against all their faith criteria, and not just financial benchmarks. And then third, the best organizations practice active stewardship. So, for example, they retain their proxy voting rights, they file shareholder resolutions, and they treat their capital as a voice, not just as a holding. So those three habits, more than any single document, separate the leaders from the rest.
So the positive investment challenge. So the weakest scores across the data set are in positive screening and education. So these are, positive screening is an area that requires organizations to move from avoiding harm to actively deploying capital for good. Why is that shift so hard? What explains the positive investing criteria receiving such a low score?
So negative screening is clearly the easiest half of that work. You produce a list, you exclude, and you move on. Positive investment asks something fundamentally different. It asks an organization to articulate what they're for, not just what they're against, and then define capital vehicles that deliver on that vision. So three barriers show up in the data. First, there's a persistent perception that financial returns and transformative outcome are attention, even though the evidence increasingly exists that it's different, it's otherwise, that you can do both. You can make a suitable return, a competitive return, and achieve a positive outcome. And then second, the product language is genuinely thin. Tailored faith-aligned vehicles are scarce, especially for some of the smaller asset owners. And then third is education. Like I said earlier, our weakest score is 1.4, and committees often haven't been equipped to evaluate positive opportunities. And so you can't deploy capital towards a vision if you haven't been trained to make an assessment.
Thank you, Dave. And please do feel free to add your questions in the chat. We do want to hear from you, or if you have any general comments or anything that struck you from the results. Dave, let's just look at the ecosystem question. So the report makes clear that no faith investor is going to get to the outstanding level alone, that it is like an ecosystem process. What does that tell us about what actually needs to change, not just for individual organizations, but across the wider ecosystem of asset managers, advisors, consultants, faith networks?
Yeah, so I think, Catherine, that this is probably the most important finding in the report, that the organizations that were performing best weren't simply better resourced, they were better connected. They had denominational investment offices. They shared their screening frameworks. They pooled vehicles. They had specialist advisors that were fluent in their tradition. And so where that ecosystem exists, performance improves. Where it doesn't, organizations are essentially trying to build it from scratch. They're trying to recreate the wheel. So the change has to be system-wide. Asset managers need to develop genuinely faith-aligned products, not products that are simply labeled ESG. Consultants and advisors need to build faith expertise as a recognized competency. Denominational bodies need to expand shared infrastructures for organizations that are too small to build their own. And then faith networks need to collaborate across traditions where values converge. No single actor and no single organization gets to outstanding on their own by themselves.
Thanks, Dave. I'm aware that we may just go over a little bit over time, but let's do it because I do want to ask you about, the call to action here. So for any of our faith organizations that are here with us today, what's the one step that they can take this year?
So for those that are attending, as you know, Catherine mentioned that all the investment policies that we analyzed were publicly available. And we know that there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of organizations that have investable assets that have an investment policy. So if you're looking for that one step, it's send us your investment policy and guidelines and let us assess them. Every organization has a starting point, and most don't actually know where that starting point is. So with our baseline assessment against the 10 criteria, Catherine, that you talked about earlier, we can provide you with a clearer picture of the strengths and then the opportunities on things that you can build on. It's diagnostic, it's not punitive, and it helps turns the good intentions of your denomination into a concrete development plan. So then the one ask is send your investment policy and guidelines to Faith Invest. There's no cost to the analysis. We do it at no cost for you. And that single act moves you from aspiration into action and into a growing community of faith asset owners doing the same work together.
Thanks, Dave. And for those of you that are not aware, our web address is www.faithinvest.org, and you can find more information there about how to reach us. So we've gone a little bit over time, but we're going to wrap up now. Ultimately, we hope that this report contributes to a more practical and constructive conversation about what is needed next to guide and support faith organizations that want to go further on their faith consistent investing journey. Just to close, thank you for joining us here today. Thank you for giving us your time. Good Intentions 2026 is now freely available to download from the Faith Invest website. The web address is on the screen. We really encourage you to read it, to share it widely, and to use it within your own organizations and in your own faith communities. Our hope is that the report helps support more practical conversations and progress about how faith values can move from intention into implementation. Just a final notice, this webinar is actually the beginning of an ongoing webinar series that will explore in much greater detail some of the insights that you have heard today. And we will be bringing in our Good Intention sponsors to join us on the webinar series. Our first session kicks off on June the 4th, and during that session, we're going to look in greater detail at the faith values, so the faith documentation, the negative and positive screening insights, and investment vehicles. And as always, these forums are quite practical oriented. So please mark your calendars for June the 4th. You will receive more information from us about this particular forum. And of course, don't forget to register. Over the next while, we will be sharing the recording from this webinar along with the slides and a link to our Good Intentions. We do have a summary report available, and then, of course, the much larger report as well. Thank you again for joining us today.